Well, I can't say enough about the music today. The orchestra, you always make it a great day. The choir is absolutely fabulous today. Thank you very much. I'm concluding a series today on the vows of the church. I thought you might have gotten tired of this, but you have been very encouraging from week to week. And so for the fourth time, I'm going to show you the way in which I have rewritten the vows of the United Methodist Church. Here's the way they used to read here at Christ Church. Will you be loyal to the United Methodist Church and support it with your prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness? I've never cared for that vow because of the emphasis on loyalty, that it's a kind of a one-way, be loyal to the institution. It seems to me that the vows of the church should involve a mutual commitment to grow with one another. And so this is the way we've rewritten the vows, and for the last 4 weeks, we've already had several families join today. This is the way we offer the vow. Will you remain engaged in the ministries of the church and continue to grow spiritually by being generous with your prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness? The emphasis on three things: remaining engaged in ministry, service, commitment, prayers, all of that. Growing spiritually, which is really the point of the spiritual life, right? The trajectory. We want to grow deeper and broader in our spiritual lives. And then prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness become not the markers of loyalty, but the guideposts that help us gauge our growth over time. Now, let me just say a couple of things. Tomorrow, I'm going to send to the bishop the new vow, the way we've written it and the way we're offering it here at Christ United Methodist Church. And so if I'm not here next week, you'll know he didn't cotton to it, as they say in East Texas. I think he'll like it, actually. The other thing I will say is that I've preached on presence, prayers, service, and today I'm preaching on witness. I've not preached on gifts, but as you know, this is Commitment Sunday, and the most generous, I oftentimes say the most generous congregation in Methodism. We're asking you to be even more generous. We ask for two things this time every year, and a lot of non-members make these kinds of commitments. We ask you to make a commitment. Start with a commitment of some kind. And if you've been making a commitment, we ask you to prayerfully consider growing that commitment. That's been the emphasis this year. So maybe if you came and you've already filled out your prayer card, I'm always struck by the number of prayer cards that when we finally get them, commitment cards, they've marked off that amount because they've prayed about it or been impacted by the service, and they grow during the service. But that's our request. We're not going to preach any sermons on generosity of gifts, but we are pleased to thank you for your generosity and to ask you to grow in terms of your commitment to the transformational ministries here, and the knowledge that generosity always transforms the lives of givers as well. Okay, today, witness. We're going to read from the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the story of the early church. I confess that early in my ministry, I didn't preach much from Acts because the story of the church didn't seem as compelling to me as the story of Jesus. In recent years, I've really been struck by the power, the insight, and wisdom from Acts. So we're going to read here from the 16th chapter. Paul and Silas have been out there witnessing, preaching, and they've made some people angry. They've been thrown in a Roman jail, and this is what happens. After midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was an earthquake, so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open and everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors wide open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. He knew that his superior would order his death because of his failure to guard the prisoners properly, so he's going to commit suicide. But Paul shouted in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights, and rushing in, he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them outside and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" In other words, what must I do to be like you? And they answered, "Believe on the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. At the same hour of the night, he took them and washed their wounds. Then he and his entire family were baptized without delay. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. About 20 years ago, I preached a sermon, and honestly, I don't remember what the sermon was about. I don't really remember anything about the sermon except that it was well received. Every once in a while, a preacher will get a chance. We call them home runs. Every once in a while, over 40 years, there haven't been many, but over a period of 40 years, every once in a while, I've hit a home run, a sermon that was really well received. What I do remember about that sermon was a conversation that took place on the Wednesday afterwards. For some reason, I walked into the workroom of the church where we have our copying machines and printing materials. And there was a woman in there who was a volunteer for us, and she came up to me and she immediately engaged me about the sermon. She said, "Don, your sermon on Sunday was just wonderful. I just loved it." And then she looked me in the eyes and she said, "I wish you would preach that way all the time." I looked at her, I said, "Barbara, I'm doing the best I can." And I say that all the time. The staff has heard me say this. In the Methodist Church, we're all doing the best we can. When I'm not here, occasionally, if I have a day off, a Sunday off, I like going to there are a couple or three little tiny country churches I go and worship, 40 or 60 people. I love these churches. They're there, not because of the music or whatever. They're just there because they love Jesus. But I'll say this, in every church I've ever attended, the preacher was doing the best she could do or the best he could do. The choir, it might be a little choir, may not have great talent in it like our choir does, but they're singing the best they can. It's just kind of one of my mantras. In every church, people are doing the best they can. And so when it comes to these, what I call the guideposts of faithfulness, our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, we can kind of gauge how well we're doing, can't we? If you've joined the church, you've made a commitment to be present in the church most of the time, you can gauge that, you can measure it, you can know whether or not you're fulfilling your hopes and expectations about your discipleship, your decision to follow Jesus. We can count the money in the offering plates. More importantly, these days, we have ways of gauging or counting the outcomes produced by that money in terms of ministry that changes and transforms lives. We can count the number of service projects, the number of people served. You know whether you're engaged in a daily routine of prayer and meditation or not. But the question this morning, and I find it a fascinating question, is this question about witness. What does it mean to witness for the church? And more importantly today, what is the witness of the church? And why is it important? And what are the hallmarks? How do we gauge what the witness of the church should be at its very, very best? So I started reading through Acts to answer that question. Acts, again, is the history of the early church. And there are 4 stories I want to share with you really briefly that I think tell us what the early church was all about and describe for us what the witness of the church is all about at its very best. The first story is in the 2nd chapter of Acts. Some of you may be familiar with the day of Pentecost. We're told about it at the beginning of Acts 2. Jesus had told the disciples to go to the temple in Jerusalem, to go every day and pray until the Holy Spirit descended upon them. And they did that day after day after day they went. One day the Holy Spirit descends. And we're told that it was like tongues of fire coming down. And people could speak in each other's language. People were speaking in all sorts of tongues. And there was a revival in the beginning of the church on that particular day. It was remarkable. At the end of the 2nd chapter of Acts, we see the church in its infant stages. It's just started. The people are coming together. They're worshiping with one another. And this is a description that we find of the early church at the conclusion of Acts 2. If anybody was poor amongst them, somebody would sell their land or their possessions and divide it up so that nobody was in need or want. And then this conclusion. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and they ate their food with glad and generous hearts. I love that phrase. They shared their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. That means all the people, including the non-Christians to whom they were witnessing. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. When we turn over to the 7th chapter of Acts, we find the story of someone some of you are familiar with, the story of Stephen. He's known as the first martyr of the church. And in chapter 7, Stephen preaches a sermon. It's a compelling sermon, but it's a truthful sermon, and there are parts of it that are confrontational. And by the time he gets to the end of his sermon, he's made so many people angry that they decide to kill him. They rush him and they stone him to death. And so Stephen is young, he's very young. And as Stephen goes down in the midst of this hail of stones, this is what he says. It's a remarkable moment in the history of the church. This is the way chapter 7 ends. While they were stoning Stephen, he prayed in these words, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he knelt down and cried out in a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he died. Those were the final words of Stephen, like the final words of Jesus on the cross. They were words of love and inclusion. Lord, do not hold this against them. In chapter 15, we read the story in chapter 15 back in June, I think it was. Chapter 15 is the story of what's known as the Jerusalem Council. And this is what had happened. Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Peter and others had gone out preaching the gospel around the world. And they came back to Jerusalem with this remarkable story. Up until then, the Church of Jesus Christ had really just been a corner, a sect in the back of the synagogue. They were all Jews who thought that Jesus was the Messiah. But their preaching had been so powerful, they came back and they said, guess what? We never guessed this would happen. But we now have Gentiles, uncircumcised Gentiles who are coming to us, and they say, we want to follow Jesus. And we believe they've heard the word, and we believe their faith is genuine. We think they ought to be able to join the church. So the church had its first big church fight, and I mean it was a doozy. Because there were a lot of Orthodox Jews in the church at that point that said, no way are we going to let the heathen inside our church. No way is a Gentile going to join the church. Certainly no way will an uncircumcised Gentile become a part of the church. But in the end, Paul and Peter and Barnabas and others had their way. They were convinced that the church was big enough that it should include everyone. And they had a vote. And they said, let those Gentiles in, circumcised or not. And the church grew bigger, and the church grew in its love. And then the story we have for today. Paul and others had been out there preaching. They'd made some authorities angry over one thing or another. They'd thrown them in this terrible jail. They had not only locked them behind steel doors, but they had shackled them. And God sends an earthquake which opens the door and drops the shackles from their wrists and their ankles. But they do not escape. They do not escape. St. Augustine wrote a couple of books that are classics in Christianity. One was called The Confessions, in which he talked about his years of harassing women. The other was a sermon that he called The City of God. And he said, by the way, he was confessing. It was the book of confessions about harassing women. But he wrote this book called The City of God, in which he contrasted the city of God with what he called the city of man, which was Rome. And he said it's two different deals. In the city of man, in the city of Rome, it's about competition, it's about victory, it's a zero-sum game. It's about getting even. In the city of God, it's about love and reaching out. And this is such a perfect example of that contrast, because in this moment, this Roman guard comes out and he realizes that the prisoners could have escaped, but they didn't escape. It was something that just literally blew his mind. The way his world worked, his city of man world worked, the Roman world worked, was that they would have left. They perhaps would have killed him on the way out. And all of a sudden, he sees something remarkably different. They don't leave. And not only that, but they love him, they embrace him, and they include him and his family as the followers of Jesus. So these 4 stories from the history of the early church, what do they tell you about the witness of the church? 2 words come to mind: love and inclusion. The history of the church was about pure love, love for God and love for others. You might say that Stephen was so in love with God that he could not help but love those who were stoning him to death. That Barnabas and Paul and Peter were so in love with Jesus that they could not help but love these uncouth Gentiles that said, "We want to be like you, we want to follow Jesus." The hallmark of the church, the early church, and of the church today, it is all about love. And the second value, inclusion. There's this song we sing around here a lot called "Draw the Circle Larger." Draw the circle bigger, draw people in. Mary Harris puts it this way. She's our director of hospitality of Welcoming Ministries. We want them all. Of course we do. That's the way the church has always been. And so in the early church, at the end of the 2nd chapter of Acts, they're in there, they've set their tables, and they're always inviting more people. The Lord was adding hundreds a day to this remarkable community whose life was guided by love for God and love for one another. Stephen, going down in the midst of a hail of stones, says, "God, forgive them, love them, include them." In the Jerusalem Council, the church deciding that the church can't be large enough, and that in fact it's not large enough, if it isn't large enough to include them all. Paul and Silas, placing their arms around their captors, loving them, bringing them in, including them. Maybe we can get a clear understanding about what it means when we talk about the witness of the church in today's world. And what I'm about to say isn't going to surprise any of you if you've been around here for a few years. The church, the world needs the church now more than ever before. I think we can be honest about this. Half of you are in one ideological camp and half of you are in another ideological camp. Outside the walls of the church, those 2 camps hate one another. It is a zero-sum game. My side's going to win completely, and your side is going to lose completely and grovel in the dirt. I'm in my 7th decade, and I think all of you that are my age would agree. We've never seen America more divided than it is now. We've never seen greater disdain and hatred for people with whom we disagree than we have now. And we look at the world in which we live and the America in which we live, and we see the fabric of the society that holds us together. We see it just coming apart right in front of our eyes. So there are times when I've talked about the fact that the church needs a revival. The truth of the matter is, the church doesn't need a revival. America needs a revival led by the church. And a revival where we claim what it was that God gave us, love for one another. We can disagree about politics, but when you come into this place, we are brothers and sisters. And a kind of love where we include everyone. Everyone. You see if I'm not right about this. I mean, you can go down the great institutions of America, all of them becoming weaker. But you can go down, whether it's Congress or the courts or, I don't know, the Rotary Club, you name it. Even the Boy Scouts of America, these are great, great organizations. Only one institution in America is defined by this word, love. And by the inevitable conclusion, the inevitability of love is that which reaches out and draws the circle bigger. Love and inclusion. What would happen if the church were to truly claim with passion the witness that God has given us to love and include everyone? When I was a sophomore in college, something happened that really changed me forever. I came home from college one weekend, I don't remember why. My father was the pastor of what he would call a silk stocking church. It was a fairly large church in a fairly large city. It was, by most standards, a wealthy church. It was a lot of diversity in the church, but there was a lot of wealth in that church. A pure Gothic building, one of the great Methodist buildings in Texas. This has been 1968 or so. And I remember coming home that weekend, and Sunday morning came, and I agreed to go to church with my mother. And she always sat in the same place, about a third of the way back, right over there on the right-hand side. So I remember sitting there with her in church. The service had gotten along fine. My father stood up to preach, and then all of a sudden I heard a little bit of commotion. And I heard people kind of whispering and heads turning, and I turned. It would have been on my right side. I was sitting over there, but this would have been on my right side. And I turned and I saw what was causing the commotion. There was a woman walking down the aisle. It had been in that little area right there, walking down the aisle. And she was an unforgettable character. She was tall and statuesque, middle-aged, at one time had clearly been a beautiful woman, but now past her prime, you might say. Something was off. I couldn't figure it out at first. And then I noticed the way she was dressed. She was dressed in very expensive clothes, but way out of style. This was 50 years ago. I still remember she had one of those fur, a fox stole. You remember a fox stole that had the little fox head, you know, on it? If one of you were to wear a fox stole to church, I wouldn't accuse you of being out of style, I don't think, but I mean, she had these clothes, and they were expensive clothes, but they were way out of style. And not only that, she was wearing big high heels, and she was wobbling as she came down, like this. And when she passed the pew that my mother and I were sitting on, I realized why. I could smell the alcohol coming from her. My mother later told me who she was. A number of people in that church knew who she was. She had been a very high-priced prostitute. No longer had any customers. And she was a bad alcoholic. In front of me, about 4 or 5 pews, was what I called Widows' Row. 4 widows who sat in the same place every single Sunday. They were all up in years. They were all very wealthy. And they were all what I called elegant. And I watched with fascination as this woman wobbled down the aisle and turned into their pew, walked down the pew till she was at the end and sat down next to the one on the end. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. I could have never guessed how interesting it was going to be. As my father was about 5 or 6, 7 minutes maybe into his sermon, this woman who was sitting almost in front of me, a little bit to the right, I have such a clear picture of this, 4 pews in front of me, she was sitting straight up, and then all of a sudden she just disappeared. She just, and she was gone. 3 or 4 minutes went by, and all of a sudden she appeared again. Here she comes, just like this. I mean, it was clear she'd passed out, she'd come to. 5 or 6 minutes went by, and there she went again. She just disappeared. Then she came back. I'm ashamed to admit this today. I truly am. But I was a college student. I thought this was the best show in town. I mean, I was getting hysterical. My mother was pinching me on the arm like she did when I was 6 years old, trying to keep me settled down. About 2/3 through the sermon, she disappeared a third time. And then she came back up. And then it happened. The widow sitting next to her took out her arm and put it around her shoulder, drew her close, embraced her, and there she held her for the rest of the service. This is just a footnote. That widow was, at that time, one of the wealthiest women in the state of Texas. Were I to call her name, there would be a few of you who would recognize that name. I'll never forget it. Holding that woman in her arms for the rest of the service. It was an important moment for me. You see, I was struggling with my call to ministry at the time. It was never clear to me at that point, and it took a while after that even, but I was wondering about the church. On the one hand, I felt called to be a part of the church, but on the other hand, I wasn't sure. On the one hand, my grandfather had been a pastor, my father was a pastor. I thought maybe I should be a pastor, but on the other hand, I wasn't sure the church had it in it to be relevant in today's world. In that moment, I knew that the church had at least the possibility of always being relevant and powerful in any world. I'm not sure I would be standing before you today had it not been for that widow who reached out and loved this woman, drew her in, and included her. I'm not sure I would be here this morning had it not been for her witness and the witness of the church. We can be honest about this, can't we? We know that now is more important than ever. We know that now is the time for the witness of the church to become a transforming force in the life of our city and in the life of this community and in the life of our country. We can be honest about this, can't we? We know that living within a 5-mile radius of this church are all sorts of families with literally thousands of children who don't know the first thing about the love that Jesus has for them. or about the fact that there are people who want to draw the circle wide enough to draw them in. We can be honest about this. When it comes to the witness of the church, there is no point at all saying, well, let somebody else do it. If we don't do it, it won't get done. I'm praying today. I'm praying for the church. I'm praying for the witness of the church. I'm praying for you and me that we might keep it strong.